Okay, I hope you're doing well. I'm going to just do a video to talk about cults, high pressure, high control groups. I've been watching a few podcast type series on YouTube, watching/listening. And it's a very interesting topic. Let's see. It's in part what's interesting is the human drama. That these groups, in a sense, are sort of like bite-sized societies, bite-sized glimpses into the human drama, into the human dance. They're not perfect analogs, but they are sort of like microcosms for, not sure what word to use here, the nation or civilization or society. And there's a number of ways that's not a perfect analogy, but you get to see a lot of, in a way, it's a digestible unit for study, almost like a laboratory for study of many different dimensions of human experience that you sort of don't have as easy access to when you're thinking in terms of larger units, like something like a nation. They're just, at that scale, it's just too complicated, there's just too much happening there, to really get a grasp of the project holistically, or the phenomenon holistically. But within a cult or a high control group, it's a smaller scale, but there's still so much going on there. Anyways, so I think that's part of the fascination. Now, there's another facet of it is it's almost, and connected to this, it's a mirror in some sense, a dark mirror you could say, but it's a mirror in some sense, and can serve, I think, as a sort of inoculation for the general population, or for the viewer in different dimensions, because you get to see, the fact that we're calling something a cult, or that we're aware of a group that's a high control group or a cult, the fact that it's come to public awareness, public consciousness, general awareness, I think definitionally that fact is because something has gone wrong. I think that's safe to say, almost definitionally, the fact that I'd be aware of a group or that it would be something to be talked about is because something has gone wrong. And it's worth noting here that there are so many different affiliations, so many different groups out there, so many different ways to gather, and not all of them, would be categorized as unhealthy in this way, as cult-like, as cults, as, whatever. And so there's a broader category here of, and I'm not sure what the category would be, because I could say human groups, but that seems like so general that it almost means nothing. I mean, you can sharpen it a little bit to say spiritual and religious groups. Though I am aware that a lot of these dynamics, that we ascribe to the cult phenomenon are that they transcend categories. In other words, you can find cult-like dynamics in other domains, not just in spiritual or religious contexts. You can have businesses that take on certain cult-like features. You can have, in other words, it's like there's a constellation of behavioral structures, behavioral patterns, and traits. Not every cult has all of them, but every cult has a critical amount of these traits, enough of these traits to be classified as such, and severe enough of these traits to be classified as such. But I think it's maybe more helpful to think of, that there's kind of a constellation of different traits, and I don't have that. I'm sure I'll touch upon it as I go here, but I don't have that, conceptualization, that definitional breakdown of, because there are certain, I guess probably support groups for people who have gotten out of cults that have taken the time to carefully inventory and categorize and define the different features of a cult. But yeah, I think it's a pattern that is far-reaching beyond just, prototypically maybe we could say in a spiritual community or spiritual group. But you see that flavor of dynamic in, like I said, in businesses, in political movements, ideologically driven political movements, in business, in family systems, in romantic relationships, in friend dynamics, internally. I mean, there's a template there that is not disconnected from so many domains of human relating. And so, but at that level of analysis, it kind of gets so broad and general that the term stops being useful. And so in a way, it's helpful to zoom in on something in particular, and then you can see in a particular case, boundaried case, well-defined space, what it is that's being talked about as unhealthy, as damaging, as abusive, as manipulative, whatever. And you can then get that, almost that quality, that energetic quality or that relational quality, and you can see how it permeates, throughout human human relating, I guess. Anyways, but yeah, there is this sort of inoculatory, is that a word? Function that paying attention to some of this can provide, that you can see in a sort of vicarious way, at a remove, at a safer remove, at a distance, watching a documentary or reading or whatever about a group, you can come to see just how crazy it can get, and you can learn the signs of healthy relating, healthy groups, unhealthy relating, unhealthy groups, and hopefully not have to run that experiment yourself, right? That's one of the potential benefits, I think, of engaging with the topic, to be better prepared, better informed, better able to discern. And there is a wealth, a glut, a wealth of information, an embarrassment of riches on this topic, especially nowadays. And I want to say historically, too, that this is not so disconnected from a kind of larger historical movement. It would not quite be the right way to say it, but especially in the U.S., but across time, across many places, across cultures. But I'll just speak in the U.S. There has been a kind of a long-standing pattern. I don't know if tradition would be the right word here, but phenomenon or pattern of, let's say, utopian projects, utopian endeavors. And a part of that has to do with some very primary dimensions of American identity, freedom of religion being one, freedom of religion, freedom of association. And that from a very early stage in the European presence here that develops into the nation state of America, the role of these kind of noble, high-minded, utopian communities, religious communities, that has been a presence since the very start of what becomes the United States. Puritans, Quakers, Anabaptist. I'm not going to get all the names right here, but that you have from a very early stage, I guess, what would this be, 1600s, groups fleeing religious persecution or looking for a new place to practice novel or alternative, or I mean, it's in this broader context of the Protestant Reformation and that Protestant fragmentation into 10,000 denominations, right? And the U.S. has been one of the primary, probably the main places that fragmentation has played out. I can't think if there would be any other country on the planet that has seen such a diffusion, such a proliferation, such a fragmentation of Christianity in this case, such a profusion of different denominations. I think probably be the U.S., and I don't think there'd be another country that would be anywhere close. And if there is, it'd be, former British colony, probably, maybe Canada or Australia or something. Anyways, but how that's taken shape is many different shapes, but one of the shapes that it's shown up as is these sort of miniature theocracies, or these religious communities that have gone all in on, all in on a commitment to a specific religious, spiritual way of living, a holistic, wholesale, every dimension of their life permeated by and organized by religious values, religious commitments. And so that's been going on for a long time, and it's no surprise that something like the Mormon Church, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, we have all these examples we can point to of these groups and these projects and these sort of utopian visions, city on a hill, trying to bring heaven to earth, trying to do something radically different than the debauched, fallen, debased, desacralized. There's another D word in here I can't think of right now. Profane world, right? These communities that have said, I see what the world is, let's do something different. And it's there's a lot to be said there. But so there's a tradition there, or at least a broader historical context, and you can't say that all those groups are cults. Some of them are just spiritual groups that have found a relatively healthy way to exist as a community. And then, even continuing on into the 50s, maybe, for sure 60s and 70s, the communes in the US. Most of those, I guess it'd be a mixed bag, but those are not all exclusively Christian. I think probably predominantly non-Christian groups, but still groups that are committed to specific, you could say, countercultural, alternative values. Some of them at the vanguard. Some of in a sense here again, I almost see them in some instances as sort of vanguard laboratories of trying out different ways of human relating and configuring relationships, configuring not just relationships, familial relationships, romantic relationships, relationships to governance, relationships to agriculture. I think it's not a stretch to say that some of the kind of vanguard permaculture stuff, organic stuff, has some roots in, or there's some experimentation that was facilitated by some of these communal groups and communal experiments. I'm guessing here, I would say in the 60s and 70s. And you don't want to say that's all bad, for sure not, because if you were to be that dichotomist, that black and white, and say all these groups are bad or something, you would by default, I think, be saying that the way that the world is arranged and configured, in a kind of mainstream configuration of the world, is an unalloyed good. And that's just not the case. I mean, I don't want to go off on some big rant here, but it's just obvious that that's not the case, that there are... Anyways, let me not get too far into that. And so yeah, so there's a fascination on just many different levels, peering into these groups and getting a sense of what that's like. And it's interesting, watching these documentaries or watching these podcasts. Mostly what they are, at least one of them, the other one has a little bit more production complexity and value and stuff, but a lot of it is just interviews with former members talking about the experience. And I guess that's part of what is so horrifying, sick, hurtful, painful about a cult, about a high control group, is that the promise of the group, the aim of the group, at least the stated aim, and often the sincere aim, especially if you look chronologically over the lifespan of a group, kind of that initial, and that's another thing to maybe talk about, is the sort of lifespan of a group, but that they purport to are founded upon typically such high ideals, and they are centered on such deep core parts of the experience of being a human on this planet. In the case of in the case of the spiritual community, the religious community, we're talking about one's relationship to God, to the sacred, to what is most meaningful in life. And so to have a perversion of that or abuse in that relationship, perversion of that value, of those values, of that connection, one's connection with God, is bad, but it's worse than it's sick, it's awful, it's horrifying. And so, I had a bunch of different reactions watching this, listening to and watching these podcasts, these interviews. One of them in particular, actually both of them kind of in their own way, but one of them in particular sort of validated a recognition and a sense I had within myself previously about this particular group, who I am familiar with and had some pretty minimal interactions with, but had definitely engaged a lot with their material, online, YouTube, etc., mostly YouTube. And so sort of validating in that sense. And as horrifying as some of the stories are, somehow not so surprising, because I had already, I have so studied these groups and have lived long enough and had my own experiences with life that at this stage, I don't know that I would be shocked by much. Still horrified, or maybe shocked, but not surprised. And I'm not even sure shocked, unfortunately, at this point. But so it was more just kind of a validation of cues and things I had been kind of picking up in the background. And so it's good, and I want to say some things, maybe some of them a little bit challenging here, but mostly it's a good thing for when somebody comes forward and shares their experience about a group and the abuse that they experienced, or the manipulation, or the unhealthy patterns, or whatever that they experienced, that's a good thing. And that's just a good thing. And you hate the abuse, it's awful, it's wrong, it's bad, it's sick. That's all true. That's all true. That's all true. And I want to say something a little bit more about that. I want to add something there. But let me see if there's something else before I get to that. Yeah, so I guess let's see. It's hard to talk about the cult, and there are different configurations again. That's why I think it's probably more helpful to think of a sort of constellation of traits and a sort of a spectrum. And there's no perfect group. That's another thing that should be said. Every form casts a shadow. There's no perfect group. And so I think the thing is, like, at what point does something cross into being what could be classified as a cult? Cult is just a term, it's just a label on one level. It's useful. There's a very important, useful, conventional usage of that term that is useful, because you're able to identify something that might otherwise just be kind of too diffuse. It's like you can sharpen the focus by saying something like that. And it can be very useful. It can give a language. It can also provide a way of orienting such that one can start to decondition themselves, having been in a really unhealthy group. They can access resources, once they have that understanding of a group as a cult or a high control group, whatever. And at the same time, it's just a label, right? And so what we're talking about here on a deeper level is a phenomenon. It's a social, religious, human phenomenon. And at what point does that cross over into being something unhealthy? And that's not a perfect science, although it's not that complicated either. But I guess I'm just trying to say that you can have a degree of confusion, distortion within any group. It doesn't necessarily, it's an unhealthy group. I think it's that there's a critical threshold when you have a certain number of elements in place. Again, I'd have to have the kind of working definition, and I'm sure there's a cult survivors network or something like that has a good breakdown of that. But one of those features is that there is I don't know if I want to rush into that part. Before I get there, why do people get into cults? That's another good question, deep question, and many different possibilities. One of those, I think, is there's something deep about identity and belonging and affirmation for a number of people, for a lot of people, for everybody to some degree, I would think. But that there's something appealing about coming together around a shared identity. And this transcends, a spiritual group, but is definitely one of the features that is really important, really salient here, is this longing for identity and the discovery of identity and a shared identity, especially in a cause that has high aims, that isn't just kind of default madness of reality. It's like people saying, let's do something different here. It doesn't have to be this way. Heaven on earth, right? Let's do something different. Let's orient in a different way. Let's make choices here as people coming together to do it a different way. And so that is a part of it, and that's a deep thing there. It can be a deep thing. It can also be a very superficial thing. And maybe I'll touch back on that here. But there's so much commonality between groups that there's a lot of diversity within that. Under that term of cult, if we're using that word, there is a ton of diversity in terms of the actual beliefs, in terms of the actual, time period, cultural location, demographic makeup. So there's a lot of variety in that sense. But what's common is a certain, again, set of structures, of relational patterns. And one of those is the charismatic leader. I'm kind of hesitating to go into that one too quickly because it's kind of too, easy, or I can't think of the right way to. But one of those is the often, I don't know if always, maybe always, but most of the groups that will come to mind when you think of the word cult, there's typically a charismatic central figure, teacher, guru, priest, prophet, preacher, leader of some kind. And again, there's a healthy version of this that is not a cult. So again, it's down to traits. It's not any one particular configuration, but it's down to a certain amount of traits coming together. But and I want to say, because I want to try to say something different here about the topic, but let me say something that should be said kind of foundationally. When things go off the rails and they get very nightmarish, controlling, fascistic, hellish, and then we come to the question of accountability and responsibility for the wrongdoing, I think the conventional sense of the conventional legal terms in terms of justice and the conventional moral framework of individual accountability is useful and is the primary lens if we're talking about healing and accountability, etc. And I would say in that case, the guru figure is typically, again, I'm going to be very black and white, the bad guy. There's more to say about that, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to flag that as being important, because it is. That's if we have to, or where we have to place accountability. Accountability and abuse and power flows in these structures from the top down. In one way of looking at it. So let me just bracket it that way. But and it's wrong, it's wrong, the abuse that they perpetrate upon their followers and people who have invested and they prey upon. In one sense, I see these groups as sort of energetic pyramid structures, pyramid schemes. In the same sense, with the financial pyramid scheme, the foundation is non-existent, totally unstable. It relies on continual input to keep the scheme going, and it's all funneled towards the top. I think, am I getting that right? I think there's something very similar, if not the exact same phenomenon happening in these groups, but at an energetic level. And it's because typically, when you look at the psychological profile of a lot of these leaders, there is a major narcissistic wound. There's a major gift, usually, and a major wound. That's often how these things happen. Or a major gifting of a certain set of skills, but also a major deficit, a major wound, a major insufficiency, inadequacy, weakness, darkness, however you want to frame that. And almost an addictive, there's almost a kind of an addictive dance or an addictive pattern where part of the group and the main part of the group is sort of oriented in implicit ways around this wounding embodied, unaddressed, or maybe not embodied isn't quite the right word, but located in the central figure, in the guru. And that wound, just like at the core of most all addiction, there's some kind of unaddressed deficit. It's usually not just one thing. It's usually kind of a jumbled up mess of a lot of pain and wounds. But and so the energy of the group, and it tends to take the form, it can take the form of different things, but the power, concentration, can't think of quite the right word here, and the manipulation is usually oriented towards getting energy from the people in the group. And that comes in the form of more and more rigid dogma within the group, more and more control over the group. And often, there's kind of three categories, I would say. Control over people's lives, just kind of a power over somebody's life, that kind of control. Power over their finances, so control over people's behavior and choices, control over their finances, and then often sexual control. And those are all needed, I think, as a way of shoring up the kind of, if we're looking at it in really psychological terms, the narcissistic wound of the teacher. Now, it's not quite that simple. Actually, it's not even close to, but I think that is a big part of what happens in these groups. And so the teacher kind of preys upon. Now, there's a deeper question here of intentionality, conscious choice, how much of this is being enacted intentionally, consciously, by the teacher and by the group, and that's a real question and a deep question. But let's just say in a conventional way that there's kind of a predatoriness or preying upon that energy as a way of feeding the wound, just like any addiction. And just like any addiction, it needs greater and greater dosage over time as the addict acclimates to to higher and higher levels of tolerance of energetic input. If it was alcohol, you need more and more alcohol. If it was cigarettes, more and more cigarettes, just that trajectory of addiction. In this case, it would be something like adulation, devotion, worship, something like that is kind of the energetic or the addictive substance. I'm sure I could have said that better, but that's part of how I see some of this. And so in 1,000 different ways, on 1,000 different levels, in 1,000 different dimensions, little choices and big choices, they are all kind of magnetized and oriented in that direction, towards that addiction. And so the group then is sort of and there's more to it for sure, it's more complicated, but it's almost like there's this black hole at the center and everything's kind of funneling down into it, something like that. And once you have that kind of an understanding, that dynamic in mind, you can make sense out of a lot of the behavioral patterns, because in the life cycle of a group, you see a movement from openness towards insularness, towards isolation, towards rigidity, kind of high-minded, free-spirited ideals, towards rigidity, towards ideological control, towards dogma, towards fixed beliefs, towards, I guess, kind of a fascistic mentality, towards you see a movement also a stronger in-group, out-group partition happening between the outside world and those inside the group, and a stronger emphasis on conformity. That's the high control part of it, being more and more conformed to a specific, towards the leader, towards the group's dogma, towards a specific way of doing life. Yeah, and hold all of this loosely if you can, because I'm sort of just exploring here as well. I mean, I've thought about this a lot, but at the same time, talking about it is a different thing, and I'm kind of trying to explore some of this myself, how to express it on one level, but also just exploring the topic in general. And a lot of what I'm doing is trying to provide a bunch of different lenses, ways to look at this. And I don't think any one of them tells the complete story. But yeah, it just like how an addiction more and more comes to dominate the totality of one's existence as you become more and more in the grip, I think something similar is and that's on the kind of individual microcosmic level, at the group level, at the cult level, at that level of whatever analysis or organization. It's the same kind of a dynamic, that kind of addiction. Anyways, I think I've said enough on that. And I want to flag a couple things here, because I've been listening to these members, ex-members, talking about their experiences, and I find myself getting frustrated with them. And I've thought about it, I've talked about it, I've done some other videos and I haven't posted them, but trying to flesh some of this out. But what I find frustrating, and it's not with everyone, and I think that's part of the utility of talking about this a few times, is I've kind of gotten a little bit better, a little bit more balanced in how I'm thinking about it. I'm almost seeing that there's different levels. There are for sure different reasons people get involved. And so I almost want to say there are different categories of members, different categories of devotees, different categories of whatever the term is we want to use. Adepts, seekers, whatever, seekers after truth. Some of them are very sincere, a lot of them probably, but some of them at least are very sincere, and depends on what the group is and what the group is offering and what the goals are and orientation of the group is. But many people get involved with these groups because they love God. I mean, it's kind of as simple as that. They love truth. They want to heal. They want to do life in a different way that is not the madness of the lives that they knew in their childhood, that they've known as adults, that they've seen on this planet. They want something different. And there's a sincerity and a kind of, this would be sort of an idealistic member, right? Idealism driven or heart driven, or there's something good and sincere and genuine and good. And again, for these people that get involved, that is part of what's so sick. I think that's where the juxtaposition of the horror and the abuse is most strong, the contrast is most strong, the pain is most strongly felt, is when you have somebody that gets into it and opens up and trusts and is coming from a sincere place, to then be so, have their trust be so destroyed is sick. That's sick. And so that's one type of member, let's just say. One type of person who seeks out these groups and gets involved. Children as another category. If there's a second generation in some of these groups, or even a first generation, but their parents get involved with really young children, that's another very sad category, right? Because we are socially referencing, socially molded creatures, and when you're brought up, and that's the totality of your environment, or the predominant influence is one of these groups, it's just awful. It's bad, it's awful, it's sick. And so I want to kind of flag some of this, because I would also want to exempt some of these categories from some of the other comments I'm going to make about being frustrated. There are other categories of people who are sort of and here's where I'm not sure how to talk about this. So show me some generosity here. But, and those two categories I just mentioned, another aspect, another dimension of that is there's a kind of naivete, or a kind of naiveness, an innocence there. And so that's part of what's sick about it. Is getting preyed upon and having that be damaged. But there are other people who get involved who, and this is part of what I've been sensing in some of these interviews, where, again, as I said in the beginning, and hopefully I don't need to repeat it, but I'll just repeat it here, is it's good to bring these stories forward. And a lot of what they're saying is very awful. It's bad, it's sick, it's wrong. But I get frustrated because there's a type of person who gets into these groups who is themselves sort of I don't want to say narcissistic, because I'm really tired of the kind of overly pathologized, overly therapized. There's so much pop culture therapy speak, happening, and everybody is a narcissist. Everybody's ex especially is a narcissist. So I sort of don't want to say that word, but I'm struggling to find a better word right now. Let me just describe what I'm noticing. I've noticed with some of these people, I get the strong sense that they are, there's a total lack of self-awareness and a kind of false naivete that they take on in their movement out of the cult, in their giving a testimony of their cult experience, that is really frustrating. And I'm going to see, well, I don't know about really, that is frustrating, probably really frustrating in some ways, but and a part of me wants to say is, when I hear some of what they're saying, is we can't be so naive. I'm sorry. It's like maybe in 1960 and you walked into the People's Church and there was this charismatic Elvis Presley looking, sunglass wearing preacher in the pulpit, and you're in California and his name was Jim Jones. At that point in the cultural awareness, cultural zeitgeist, for you to walk into a situation like that and to not have recognized all the red flags, that makes sense to me, because it was still at that point a pretty novel phenomenon. even at that stage, a lot of people had enough relative health in them and relative understanding of human dynamics that they did not get captivated by Jim Jones. But at that stage of the game, makes a lot more sense that somebody would fall for that and be kind of bamboozled or overwhelmed or whatever. And again, there are a lot of caveats here, and I've tried to provide some of those, but there's also something that I feel I'd like to say about this sort of, I don't know, phony or false or faux naivete, especially in retrospect, the ways that people talk about their experiences, where, yeah, part of me just wants to say, like, how could you be so stupid? I'm sorry. I wouldn't say that to many people. It's a person by person case. And again, there are whole categories of people where I just, this would not apply. But for some people, and let me see if I can sharpen that up, adults, well-educated, which these people that I'm thinking about definitely were, culturally savvy. In other words, they weren't raised in some isolated, rural place where they, didn't know about city folk and didn't have the internet and stuff. No, these are technologically savvy, adult, intelligent people. And not that intelligent people can't find their way into a cult. Struggling to kind of parse this out, but this is sort of a cynical take for sure, all of this in a way, but this in particular is kind of cynical. But you get the sense that they got into a group like this because their own kind of validation seeking, their own need for power, their own need for approval, that they were running their own power games. And it's like, for some of these people, they just came up against a more powerful manipulative force. That for some people, the resonance with the group is that there's a similar kind of wounding pattern, or a similar, again, narcissistic wound or something there, a similar need for approval, need for relevance, need for glamour, need for that coming into a group, adopting a spiritual identity is sort of an addition to their ego, to their, that kind of egoic superstructure, that need for approval, something like that. Now, even that I don't want to condemn. That's the wrong motivations, but I don't want to condemn that because that's very human. I'm not saying that that's not a human thing to do. But I just wish that there was more self-awareness in some of these people who are talking about the group. It doesn't justify or exonerate or excuse or let off the hook all the bad stuff that happened. That's still bad. That's still wrong. And again, if we're doing that conventional justice model, the primary weight of the accountability for that harm and that wrongdoing is on the cult leader and the cult leadership. There's usually kind of a small circle around the leader that are sort of the handlers and enablers and enforcers of a lot of those unhealthy dynamics. But it's 2026. I mean, there's 500 different documentaries that most of the kind of internet literate world has seen or is aware. I just, part of me just doesn't pass the smell test that when they're sharing their stories and it's like 25 red flags in, red flag after red flag after red flag, and they're still in it, still going further into it, still, more and more commitment to it. Again, it doesn't justify or excuse the harms, but I just don't buy and then the way that they speak is that they were these innocent lambs that were um, these innocent, naive victims, I guess. Let me see if there's a better word. Lambs is a word that's coming to mind. Totally pure and innocent, getting involved in this, and we have to be more discerning. I mean, a part of me wants to say, we also, as a person looking to get involved with a group, we have a responsibility. And on the other side of that, and why this is so important, is we have the power to exercise discernment. It's a responsibility also to be an adult, to exercise discernment. Yeah, you maybe miss or dismiss one or two red flags again, because no group is going to be perfect. But time and time and time again, and just following this well-trod, well-studied, well-talked, attested to phenomenon of unhealthy, toxic, I don't really like saying that word, unhealthy, cult-like behavior, and you're still not getting the message, but then to kind of, when you're out of it, to say, that you're this perfect, I don't know. It's just frustrating. It's like, no, and a part of that is because it's like, you don't want to give away all your power like that, not just getting into it, but after the fact. In other words, I would love to hear, and I actually did hear one recently, but it's the minority of these kind of post-cult interviews. I'd love to hear somebody who said, it was bad what I experienced. It was wrong. It was sick. It was wrong. It was evil. And I see how I got into it. I see the choices that I made. Now, you don't stop there, and I think that's why it's like there's a lack of character as part of what I'm saying. And I think when you don't have that character, or maybe part of the fear for some of these ex-members is they don't want to get stuck there and sorry, I'm frustrated. Let me steel man, or say, make the case in the other direction before I go further in that direction. I think there is something healthy about being very black and white, very dualistic, post-involvement with a group like that. And I think it perhaps can be a healthy healing trajectory and a stage of disentangling from the group, where you sort of have to project all wrongdoing, all evil, everything bad and wrong. You sort of have to locate it on the guru or on the group. I don't think that's necessarily bad, wrong, or unhealthy, if you're looking at it as a stage of healing, because you can feel a lot of shame, like, how did I get involved? And that can be a burden and a weight and can be totally crushing. I get that. And so I think there is an important stage where you sort of just say, no, all of the wrong, all of the bad, all of the evil, locating it over there. I get that, and I think that's healthy. Just like getting out of a breakup, right? That's a stage where they're totally wrong, right? The ex is a narcissist, the ex is totally wrong. And they may be, who knows? But don't stay there. And I think what happens in this day and age is you get that same drive for acclamation, for approval, for belonging, for adulation, for recognition, for likes, to put in a more modern context. That same drive can then be reconfigured into the ex, and taking on an ex-member identity, where you become the crusader. You are the totally pure, totally righteous, good one, fighting against the totally evil group, right? And there's a lot of acclaim and recognition and likes and adulation and identity, cachet, approval, etc., to be gained from that role as well, because you're doing something good. And again, it's not, there's so many shades here, and hopefully I've drawn too many of them probably, but because that's good. You do want to call these things out, and you do want to, because groups can, I mean, it's for many reasons, but one of them is the possibility that a group could be transformed by a critical mass of feedback. It's not likely, especially depending on how far in the lifespan the group has progressed, but for a number of reasons, it's good to call it out. And so I'm not saying anything, again, as I said in the beginning, I think there's an important function of speaking out and making people aware of the group and the misdeeds and the wrongdoing, etc., the abuse, the manipulation, etc. But for these individuals, and this is something I used to engage with this topic a lot when I was younger, like a young adult. Probably saw some documentaries on Jonestown or Heaven's Gate or Waco or something. I don't know. Can't really remember what started it. But I've always had a fascination, maybe just the broader category of the human experience. I know that's pretty broad, but human groups, religious groups, etc. And I didn't have this frustration then when I'd see these documentaries. I had a more dichotomous view of it all. And I haven't lost that ability to see it that way. And then I had a large hiatus of almost a decade, maybe 7 years, 8 years, something like that, 7 years of not at all engaging with this topic. And it, in part because it's a dark topic. It's like it's a dark topic. But re-engaging with it recently, it's a new thing that I've noticed this frustration. And I think that's hopefully perhaps a good thing, that I'm able to see something else at play here. Because you don't want to get stuck in that ex-member righteousness mode for everybody's sake, but for nobody else's sake, for your own sake, because you won't heal there. You're just going to stay angry, you're going to stay bitter, and you're going to miss the chance to self-reflect and to recognize, wow, I needed approval. I was using that group, right? And maybe that's not the way you want to frame it exactly. That's kind of a harsh way to frame it. But that recognition that I was trying to get something out of this group that maybe wasn't coming from a great place. And I think that recognition can be kind of painful. And so people don't want to go there. It complicates I'm totally innocent. I'm the innocent victim of this high control group. It complicates that. But the thing is, you don't stay there. You don't stay there or shame yourself for it. No, you go deeper. It's like, okay, yeah, I got into there, and maybe not for the best of reasons. I was looking for clout or acclaim or whatever. Let's go one step further with that. And that's where the healing comes. Why did I need that? Why was this so appealing to me? Why was I chasing after that? And that's a question that starts to take you in a healthier direction, because it brings you back into your own pain, your own wounding, your own confusion, your own distortions. And you don't get there by not taking any accountability for your involvement in the group. Another part is because these groups are so distorted and the behavioral patterns and so isolating that you kind of you get disoriented and you lose a sense of proportion and morality. You often end up perpetrating the unhealthy patterns, and that can be a burden, and that can be hard to reckon with. And I get that too. But I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I guess I would just want to say it's like you have a responsibility as an adult, especially in this day and age with so much information out there. And I just can't believe, especially for a couple of these people, that they had not seen, were not aware of the possibility of this kind of group dynamics, at that stage in the game. They don't strike me. There are some people that I watch and it's like, yeah, this was an innocent person who just, for all the right reasons, got involved and just didn't have the wherewithal or the necessary experience or cynicism that there was something, you could say, innocent about them or genuinely naive. But there's some people that claim that mantle, and it's hopefully just a stage in the healing process. But I think it's kind of a defense mechanism of not reckoning with their own wounds and their own patterns. And I pick up on that sometimes, and it's frustrating because you want somebody to. Anyways. Sort of want to pause here, but maybe I'll just keep going. And let me not be holier than thou, because I have gotten involved, and I did a video early on in my channel talking about this. It wasn't quite in a spiritual group, but it was in a political ideology that I got very wrapped up in. And very harmful, unhealthy set of values, and many of the sort of cult traits of insularity, of in-group, out-group, of distorted thinking, of rigidity around certain values. A lot of that was present there, and I can see clearly now, and hopefully more and more clearly all the time, not that I totally understand it all, but I can see things in my life that predisposed me to getting into a group like that. But I learned from it. I got out of it before it got, I was pretty far into it though. But I think I always had the fact that it did not get worse for me in the way that it did for some people, and that I was able to get out of it, I think was a testament to the fact that I had an awareness of some of these dynamics. I don't know, but anyways, I'm sorry, forgive me here. Because part of me wants to say, part of the reason I got involved with this group was because I was very idealistic. But another part of it was my own wounding and some of the inadequacies and flaws and weaknesses inside myself. I can see that too. Anyways, the cult figure, the central leader, that's another thing, that there's a lot of questions and different ways to look at that figure. And there are different archetypes, I think, but there are some general patterns. And one thing that I think is clear is these are individuals who are gifted, usually, maybe always, that they've been given a great gift. But individuals who have not holistically developed. And that lack of development or immaturity in other areas ends up becoming probably the main engine, or one of the main engines, primary reasons that a group toxifies, that a group goes off the rails. And it's because I think we all are given certain gifts, and we all have certain things to work on, right? Gifts and certain character flaws, right? And when there's not a balance there, a kind of holistic, or you're never going to have perfect development, I don't think, in this world, but you can put in effort to kind of help. It's almost like there's, I don't know, in my mind I'm seeing a shape, like a hexagon or something, and each of those points is one domain of development, and ideally you want to have all those in balance. And if one area is not in balance, and the angle kind of widens and the shape kind of gets off balance, something like that. And a lot of these leaders have a very